There are discoveries that change history, and then there are those that seem to interrupt it altogether, events that arrive not as accidents, but as divine appointments. The unearthing of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 belongs to the latter. A shepherd's stone, thrown into a cave near Qumran, uncovered more than brittle parchment and broken pottery. It opened a sealed window into a time long buried, a moment when heaven had spoken and then chosen to conceal its voice for generations. This was not the work of chance, but of providence, an unveiling reserved for a specific moment in time, and perhaps more importantly, for a specific generation prepared to receive it. The scrolls remained hidden for nearly 2,000 years. Through war, empire, religious upheaval, and cultural reinvention, they lay untouched, guarded by the stillness of the desert. But their concealment was not about erasure, it was about preservation. The caves in which they rested became more than tombs of knowledge. They became sanctuaries for sacred truth, waiting for hearts that would recognize the difference between curiosity and calling. The fact that these writings were discovered at the brink of Israel's rebirth, in a century scarred by global war and spiritual confusion, points to something greater than archaeology. It points to divine timing. These scrolls are not just historical records, they are revelations. They carry within them more than ink and parchment. They carry urgency. Their contents stretch far beyond ritual law or ancient liturgy. They include lost voices, rejected writings, and visions that reach into realms both spiritual and cosmic. And yet, for all their depth and complexity, the reason they have surfaced now may be simpler than we think. They are answering questions that this generation has only just begun to ask. Not questions of doctrine alone, but of identity, of holiness, of divine order, and of the unseen war between truth and deception. To hear what the scrolls have to say requires more than intellect. It requires posture. These were not texts preserved in temples of marble, but in caves carved by time. They were not kept by elites, but by those willing to separate from a system they saw as corrupt and compromised. The very location of the scrolls speaks to the nature of the message. It is not loud, it is not institutional, but it is true. It calls not to those seeking titles, but to those seeking truth. This is not a message for those looking to win arguments. It is for those longing to encounter what has been forgotten. This unveiling is not a return to the past. It is a return to something ancient yet alive. The scrolls challenge the idea that God's voice has gone quiet. They remind us that silence is not absence. That which was hidden was never lost, only withheld. And now, with their emergence, we are reminded that the divine voice has not stopped speaking. It has been waiting for the world to be ready, waiting for eyes to open, for ears to listen, for spirits to hunger once again for what is real. This is your invitation, not to study a relic, but to encounter a revelation. The scrolls were not discovered so that we could admire their age, but so that we could recognize their relevance. Their message is not finished, it is only beginning again. And you are not standing on the outside of this story. You are part of the reason it is being told. The desert has always been a place of paradox, lifeless in appearance, yet full of mystery, empty to the eye, but echoing with something eternal. There is a reason prophets did not receive their revelations in palaces, but in wastelands. A reason why Moses wandered, why Elijah fled, why John the Baptist cried out from the wilderness. These barren lands are not abandoned, they are chosen. The wilderness has always been God's quiet room, where distractions fall away and only what is eternal can be heard. And it was into this silence, into the folds of rock and dust east of Jerusalem, that the Dead Sea Scrolls were hidden. In the region known as Qumran, where the Judean desert drops into the lifeless basin of the Dead Sea, there lies a terrain so hostile that few would seek to dwell there. It is a place scorched by heat, shaped by wind, and forgotten by comfort. Yet it was here, precisely here, that sacred writings were placed in clay jars and sealed in caves. not to be found by chance wanderers for generations, but to rest under the weight of time until the hour of unveiling arrived. The desert in its silence became the scroll's guardian, not a fortress of stone or a locked archive, but a wilderness too harsh for casual explorers and too remote for careless hands. There is something divine in this method of preservation. The desert did not just protect the scrolls from the elements, it protected them from men, from those who might have distorted, destroyed, or silenced what was written. It cradled them in secrecy, not as a punishment to the world, but as a mercy, because not every generation is prepared to handle what is holy. Some truths are too weighty for immature hands, and so they were kept not simply hidden but withheld for those who would seek not with ambition but with reverence. These caves, carved by the hand of time and hollowed by nature, became more than mere shelters. They were sanctuaries. Their jagged entrances, their shadows and stillness bore witness to centuries of unspoken guardianship. While empires crumbled, while maps were redrawn, while religions rose and fractured, the scrolls remained, undisturbed and unacknowledged, but never forgotten in the mind of God. He does not bury without purpose. He conceals so that when something is revealed, it arrives not as noise, but as a sign. In the vast openness of the Judean desert, there is no room for distractions. The silence is not passive, it speaks. It confronts, it filters away all that is shallow and leaves only what matters. It is in this atmosphere that the scrolls waited. Wrapped in linen, sealed in jars, and placed deliberately in stone clefts, they became seeds of divine revelation. And like all seeds, they required darkness, time, and stillness before they could emerge and bear fruit. Consider this. The community that placed these scrolls in the caves did not do so out of panic or accident. Their movements were calculated, their decisions prayerful. These were people who lived with the weight of sacred duty, who believed they were stewards of mysteries greater than themselves. To them, the scrolls were not mere writings, they were voices, carriers of something eternal. They recognized that what they held was not for their own time alone. They knew they were writing for an age yet to come, an audience they would never meet, hearts that had not yet begun to beat. What kind of reverence does it take to write knowing your words will sleep in silence for centuries? What kind of trust must exist between the writer and heaven to place parchment in the womb of the earth and believe that it will be found when the time is right? That is the posture of the Qumran scribes. That is the devotion etched into every fragment. The desert, in its barrenness, became a vault more secure than any man-made chamber. It was untouched by invasion, left alone by conquerors, bypassed by pilgrims and armies alike. Its very hostility became its strength. The heat and aridity that drove men away became the conditions that preserved parchment, ink, and linen beyond what any library could accomplish. These scrolls endured because they were meant to. The silence that surrounded them was not empty. It was sacred space. And in that silence, a divine appointment was marked on history's calendar, waiting for its fulfillment. This was not just a concealment of words, it was the concealment of meaning, of truths not ready to be spoken, because divine timing does not simply ask when something should be revealed. It asks who is ready to receive it. The scrolls were not only hidden from sight, they were hidden for a generation that would come to a point of questioning, of searching, of spiritual famine, a generation desperate not just for answers, but for meaning. And in that longing, the caves opened. There is something profoundly humbling in knowing that the dry rocks of Qumran held what the world did not even know it had lost. Truths buried while doctrines were built, insights sealed while traditions took root. In many ways, the scrolls are not just remnants of an ancient community. They are a mirror showing what was preserved while the world moved on, and what must now be retrieved to correct a course long drifting. And so, The desert kept the secret, not from malice but from mercy, not as punishment but as preparation. It waited for the right moment when silence would give way to revelation, and when the scrolls would rise from obscurity not as relics but as messengers. Now that they have spoken, the silence has shifted. The barren land has yielded its treasure. The secret once guarded by wilderness is no longer buried. Among the parchments hidden in the caves of Qumran, beyond the expected echoes of familiar psalms and prophetic scrolls, emerged writings that startled even the most seasoned scholars. These were not just supplements to the biblical canon. They were texts that had for centuries lived in the shadows. Their names, such as the Book of Enoch or the War Scroll, carried with them the weight of controversy and mystery. They were not only forgotten, they were intentionally set aside, unspoken in sanctuaries, unacknowledged in liturgies, and for many, unknown entirely. And yet, they endured, not through preservation in institutions, but through exile in the desert, hidden by those who believed they still carried divine purpose. The presence of these writings within the Dead Sea Scrolls is no small matter. It forces a confrontation with uncomfortable questions. Why were certain voices excluded? Who drew the lines between accepted and forbidden, between sacred and suspect? It is not irreverent to ask such things. It is necessary, for the act of silencing is not always done out of discernment. Sometimes it is done out of fear. Sometimes it is done to protect power rather than truth. The scribes of Qumran seem to sense this, choosing not to erase these texts, but to shield them from erasure. Their decision to store them alongside Isaiah and Deuteronomy speaks volumes, not of rebellion, but of responsibility. Take the Book of Enoch, for example, a text that was once read and referenced by early believers, including those who shaped the New Testament, and yet today is missing from most modern Bibles. In it, there are vivid visions of heaven, insights into the origins of evil, and details about angelic rebellions that echo through other ancient sources. Its absence from the canon is not the result of fraudulence, but of discomfort. The book dares to explore dimensions that stretch theological boundaries, and in doing so, it unsettles structures that seek neat definitions. And yet, here it is, found preserved in the same desert repository as the revered scriptures of old. What does this tell us? It tells us that man's exclusion is not God's silence, that what religious authorities may reject out of policy or fear, heaven may still preserve out of purpose. These texts were not kept by the temple elite, nor were they celebrated in the courts of religious authority. They were buried, hidden, and nearly lost. But now they return, not as curiosities, but as testimonies. Their very survival through centuries of obscurity proclaims that their voice still matters. Not every writing outside of canon is divinely inspired, but not every excluded writing is devoid of divine breath either. Wisdom demands discernment, not dismissal. The War Scroll, another striking document, offers a vision not only of battle, but of cosmic order. It describes a confrontation between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, painting a landscape of spiritual warfare that goes beyond the physical. It names enemies not simply in human terms, but in unseen realities. Its pages are not merely historical, they are prophetic, filled with a language that suggests deeper meaning, even for readers today. This scroll was not designed for passive reflection, but for awakening. It pushes its reader to acknowledge a realm of conflict that theologians have often reduced to metaphor, yet which these ancient writers understood as tangible, urgent, and present. Why then were such writings silenced? In part, it may be because they speak of things that institutional religion prefers to keep quiet. They speak of angels, not as distant beings, but as players in history. They unveil the presence of evil, not only in abstract terms, but as a deliberate corruption that entered creation and altered its course. They suggest a depth of spiritual reality that challenges sanitized doctrines. These are not comfortable revelations. They provoke, they disturb, and in doing so they press against the walls erected by religious tradition. But the question remains, who decided what would be remembered and what would be erased? Was it the result of divine instruction, or was it shaped by political necessity, cultural pressures, and human fear? Throughout history, councils and clergy have debated, edited, and compiled the sacred texts. And while there is beauty in the unity of what became the Bible, there is also complexity in what was left behind. The scrolls remind us that the divine voice is not always confined to what was canonized, that truth does not bend to human convenience, and that revelation can be as uncomfortable as it is necessary. This is not an invitation to discard the Bible or to elevate every ancient text to equal status. Rather, it is a call to humility. To recognize that what we have is not all there is, that the Spirit of God speaks where He wills, not just where He is expected. And if the desert preserved these writings, it may be because their time had not yet come, or perhaps their time had come again. For in every generation there comes a moment when the hidden must be revealed, not to replace what is known, but to enrich what has been overlooked. The scrolls offer us a lens not only into history, but into our assumptions. They ask whether our view of the sacred has been shaped more by tradition than by truth. And they whisper the possibility that some voices, long silenced by men, were never silenced by God. What man fears, heaven may honor. What institutions avoid, the Spirit may embrace. The question is not whether these texts are safe, but whether we are ready to hear what they have always said. Among the fragments recovered from the caves of Qumran lies a narrative both haunting and profound, one that stretches the imagination and shakes the foundations of what many believe to be a settled spiritual history. These writings, particularly those associated with the Book of Enoch and other apocryphal sources, speak of celestial beings not as silent messengers or distant observers, but as active participants in the earliest chapters of human rebellion. They are called the Watchers, and their presence in the scrolls opens a doorway to a dimension of spiritual conflict that predates human memory and continues, unseen but unrelenting, to this very hour. The story, as the scrolls recount, is one of descent, both literal and moral. The Watchers were not demons or mythological beings, but angels, created beings of light, entrusted with oversight over creation. Their original purpose was not to corrupt, but to protect, to minister, and to guide. Yet something within them turned. Drawn by the beauty of earthly women, and perhaps stirred by a desire to possess what was not theirs to claim, they abandoned their posts. They descended not with divine sanction, but in defiance of it, forming a pact of rebellion. Their union with human women produced offspring that were never meant to exist. Giants known as the Nephilim, beings of extraordinary power, terrifying stature, and insatiable appetites. This account, far from a distant fable, is woven with eerie consistency through multiple ancient texts and traditions. The scrolls do not treat this episode as a myth, but as a solemn record, a warning encoded in sacred ink. It is presented not as folklore, but as history. History that helps explain the chaos and violence that began to flood the earth before the judgment of the Great Deluge. The corruption introduced by the Watchers was not merely physical, it was spiritual, genetic, societal. They taught forbidden knowledge, introduced destructive technologies, and unleashed chaos among men. What was once pure became perverted. What was once ordered began to unravel. This ancient rebellion matters not simply because it reveals a strange episode from long ago, but because its implications still echo through time. The spiritual war it initiated did not end with the flood. The Watchers were judged, bound, and cast into darkness, but the consequences of their rebellion endured. Their offspring, though destroyed, left behind remnants, ideologies, systems, and spiritual patterns that continued to influence mankind. The writings in the scrolls hint at a continuity of corruption, a legacy of deception that threads through history, taking new forms, but always serving the same agenda: to distort creation, to defy the Creator, and to enslave humanity through lies masquerading as light. What makes the scrolls so unsettling is not merely their content, but their timing. They re-emerged not in an age of innocence, but in one marked by rapid technological ascent, moral confusion, and growing spiritual apathy. The tales of the Watchers and the Giants are not presented as ancient curiosities, but as prophetic signals. They remind the reader that what was will be again, that the patterns of old are re-emerging under new names and appearances. They urge vigilance, not through superstition, but through spiritual awareness. For the enemy's schemes have not changed, only the masks have. In the world increasingly fascinated by the idea of beings from beyond, by stories of hybrids, enhancements, and transcending human limitations, the scrolls sound an ancient alarm. These narratives, long buried, now return to confront a culture unwittingly repeating history. Just as the Watchers offered knowledge in exchange for loyalty, modern voices offer power in exchange for identity, freedom in exchange for obedience to forces unseen. The battlefield is no longer confined to mythic past. It is the stage upon which modern humanity now stands. The presence of these accounts in the Dead Sea Scrolls was not accidental. Their preservation suggests urgency, intentionality, and purpose. The Qumran community, it seems, believed these stories needed to survive, that they would one day serve as both witness and warning. And indeed, their emergence now offers more than fascination. It offers insight. It provides a key for discerning the nature of spiritual conflict that continues to unfold, in realms both visible and hidden. It reveals a strategy not merely of aggression, but of infiltration, deception, and transformation. The giants of old may not walk the earth in physical form today, but their influence remains. It can be seen in the growing desensitization to corruption, in the redefinition of boundaries between what is human and what is beyond. It manifests in ideologies that exalt knowledge without wisdom, and in systems that promise liberation while leading to bondage. The scrolls confront this reality head-on. They are not satisfied with comforting myths. They demand that the reader reckon with the truth, that we are not alone, that the war is real, and that ignorance of this conflict does not grant immunity from its effects. To read of the Watchers and the Nephilim is to step into a story still unfolding. The scrolls place the reader not as an outsider, but as a participant in a spiritual continuum. They do not just inform, they position, and they do so with the quiet gravity of ancient voices who knew they were speaking not just to their peers, but to generations far beyond their own. They speak across the centuries to call attention to the unseen, to expose the origins of spiritual warfare, and to equip those who are willing to see with more than their eyes. Within the ancient scrolls retrieved from the dust of Qumran, there emerges the presence of a figure both haunting and heroic. He is not introduced with royal lineage or grand pronouncements. His name is veiled, his past obscure, yet his influence permeates the writings like an ember glowing beneath the ash. Referred to only as the teacher of righteousness, he stands as a solitary beacon in a world collapsing under the weight of compromise. In an age when truth was diluted, institutional power corrupted, and divine wisdom often silenced, this man rose, not for fame or recognition, but because the truth within him would not be buried. He is described not as one who led multitudes, but as one who stood alone, a singular figure resisting a tide of religious decay, pointing his generation back to the ancient path of holiness. His words pierced through layers of deception, calling his people to repentance, to purity, to alignment with the divine will. The scrolls do not romanticize his journey. They depict opposition, betrayal, isolation, and yet they do so with a reverence that suggests the Qumran community saw him not merely as a teacher, but as a prophet, perhaps even a precursor to something far greater. There is a distinct pattern woven through sacred history, a divine rhythm in which lone voices are lifted in dark times to restore what has been lost. They are often misunderstood, rejected, even hunted, yet their message carries the unmistakable mark of eternity. The teacher of righteousness fits this pattern. In many ways, his life mirrors the role played by prophets like Jeremiah or Elijah, who were called to confront not pagans, but their own people. It is one thing to shout truth into a void. It is another to speak it into a crowd that has forgotten what truth sounds like. That is what this man did. He did not merely resist the world outside, he resisted the compromise within. The scrolls paint him as a forerunner, not only in chronology but in spirit. When compared with the later ministry of John the Baptist, striking parallels begin to surface. Both men emerged from the wilderness, not clothed in prestige, but wrapped in righteousness. Both challenged religious authority. Both spoke with urgency, not to please, but to awaken. Their messages were not tailored to culture, but rooted in conviction. And both, it seems, knew that their voices would be met not with applause, but with resistance. And yet, their resistance was their badge. For truth is rarely welcome where comfort reigns. The teacher of righteousness proclaimed a path of separation, not isolation from society, but separation from corruption. He insisted on a return to the true covenant, a cleansing not of rituals alone, but of hearts. The Qumran texts describe him as one who received divine understanding, a man whose interpretations were not self-made, but divinely revealed. He was not merely reading scripture, he was embodying it, unfolding it for a people too dull to see what stood before them. Some scholars speculate that this figure was anticipating the coming of a Messiah. Others suggest that he may have seen himself as such. Still others view him as a shadow, a prophetic echo of the one who was to come, Jesus of Nazareth. While the scrolls never offer a clear answer, the similarities cannot be ignored. Like Christ, the teacher called his people to repentance. Like Christ, he faced rejection by the very stewards of religious authority. Like Christ, he suffered for truth. Whether he was a prophet or a foreshadowing, his life spoke with a tone unmistakably divine. What makes his story so powerful is not only what he said, but the fact that his words survived at all. He lived in a world where voices like his were not archived, they were erased. Yet his teachings were hidden away by followers who knew that one day the world would need them again, that one day someone would listen not to sermons of comfort, but to cries from the wilderness. And that cry still resonates, because every generation needs its voice crying out. Every era of compromise demands someone who will not bend. In the silence of the desert, the teacher of righteousness did not just preserve ancient law. He reignited the flame of devotion. He became a living rebuke to corruption and a model for all who would dare to speak truth without apology. His example lives on, not because he sought to be remembered, but because truth cannot be silenced when it is born of heaven. He may have walked before his time, but he walked in step with eternity. The War Scroll is not written like a parable. Its tone is not soft or metaphorical. There is no suggestion of allegory or symbolism wrapped in poetic flair. Instead, it reads like a manual, precise, urgent, unflinching. It presents a worldview that assumes conflict is not an option but a certainty. It speaks of an ancient war between forces defined not by human armies or political borders, but by allegiance to either divine light or corrupting darkness. The scroll does not invite interpretation, it demands alignment, and in doing so, it strips away the illusion that spiritual neutrality exists. In this writing, the sons of light are not perfect men, nor are they merely symbolic representations of good intentions. They are those who have devoted themselves to the covenant, to obedience, to truth in its unfiltered form. Their armor is righteousness. Their commander is the God of hosts. They do not fight for conquest, but for restoration. In contrast, the sons of darkness are not distant mythic villains. They represent everything that opposes divine order: corruption in high places, rebellion disguised as liberty, deception clothed in influence. This war is not about geography. It is about essence. It is about allegiance in a world designed to confuse and seduce. The structure of the war scroll is methodical. It outlines stages of battle, rotations of priests, sounding of trumpets, and blessings of warriors. It merges the spiritual with the tactical, as if to say that victory is not achieved by inspiration alone, but by discipline, strategy, and divine covering. The scroll depicts a 7-stage war, each cycle moving closer to final confrontation, until divine intervention brings about a decisive and irreversible victory. These details are not given for dramatic effect. They are provided as a revelation, a blueprint for those who are willing to understand that the physical realm has always been a surface layer resting upon deeper spiritual currents. The text makes it clear that this battle is not theoretical or distant. It is unfolding invisibly but relentlessly around and within every individual. The Qumran community believed that history was moving toward a climax, not simply in human affairs, but in cosmic alignment. They saw themselves not as observers of prophecy, but as participants in its fulfillment. The Sons of Light were not mythical heroes. They were real people, flawed but faithful, ready to take their place in a divine narrative much larger than themselves. What makes this scroll particularly unsettling is its clarity. It does not soften the language or obscure the stakes. It presents a universe in which compromise is not a virtue and indifference is a choice already made. It confronts the reader with a reality that demands a response. If the battle is real, if the sides are drawn, then to delay is to decide. One cannot drift through such a war without drifting into defeat. The scroll calls for awakening, not the kind that comes from inspiration alone, but the kind that results in transformation. In the modern world, where darkness often dresses itself in sophistication and where truth is negotiated through popularity, the war scroll feels almost foreign. It speaks in absolutes, in convictions that run contrary to the diluted tones of modern spirituality. Yet it is precisely this clarity that pierces through the fog of confusion. It does not entertain the idea of coexistence between light and darkness. It declares that these two forces are locked in opposition, not for a moment, but for the duration of history. And this declaration is not meant to breed fear, it is meant to produce clarity. The reader is left with a choice, not just of belief, but of posture. The Sons of Light are not passive believers. They are warriors, trained in discipline, immersed in Scripture, aligned with divine timing. Their readiness is not marked by aggression, but by holiness. Their strength is not in numbers, but in alignment. They win not because they are stronger, but because they are surrendered. And it is this surrender that becomes their weapon, this faithfulness that becomes their shield. For too long, many have imagined the spiritual life as a place of peace detached from battle. But the scrolls remind us that true peace is the fruit of victory, not the absence of confrontation. And victory demands engagement. It demands vision. It demands the recognition that the war is already at hand, that neutrality is a myth, and that the time to stand has already arrived. The scroll does not ask whether the listener wants to join the war. It declares that they are already in it, whether they acknowledge it or not. To understand the war scroll is to understand that every decision, every allegiance, every silence or compromise is part of a larger struggle. It is not paranoia, it is awareness. It is the ability to see that behind the politics, ideologies and headlines, there is a deeper current pulling all of history toward a final reckoning. And the scrolls, dusty and ancient as they may be, speak with a relevance that modern commentary often lacks. The sons of darkness do not announce themselves with banners. They move subtly, corrupt silently, and speak words designed to lull rather than provoke. That is why light must be more than moral preference. It must be conviction wrapped in action. The Qumran community understood this. They trained, prayed, wrote, and prepared not for speculation, but for participation. And in preserving these texts, they left behind a message more urgent than ever. This war is not future tense, it is now. And every listener is already on the field. The only question is whether they will awaken to it and take their place, or continue sleepwalking through a battle that does not wait for their awareness. The Temple Scroll stands apart from the other writings found in Qumran, not because it is louder or more dramatic, but because it dares to describe something so sacred, so exacting, that every line seems crafted with a trembling hand. It outlines dimensions, materials, sanctified rituals, and ceremonial order with a precision that would make an architect pause. Yet it quickly becomes apparent that what is being described is not merely a building of stone and gold. It is a vision of purity too perfect to be fully realized on earth, a blueprint not only for a structure, but for a reality. The temple portrayed in these writings transcends its physical form. It becomes a reflection of heaven and ultimately a reflection of the heart. The instructions in the scroll are meticulous. They speak of courts within courts, measurements precise to the cubit, and separations of space according to levels of sanctity. Nothing is arbitrary. Every wall, every gate, every altar exists for a reason. But beneath this mathematical structure lies something far more profound. The desire of God to dwell among his people, not distantly, not symbolically, but in genuine and present holiness. The temple, as revealed in the scroll, is not just a building. It is a statement. It declares that God is not content to observe from afar. He desires nearness, but not without reverence. Unlike the temples known to history, which were built and then eventually destroyed, the temple in the scrolls seems to belong to another order entirely. Its perfection suggests not only divine inspiration, but divine origin. It points upward, not just geographically, but spiritually. This is not simply the restoration of Solomon's temple or an improvement upon the tabernacle of Moses. This is something higher. It is both a reminder of what once was and a prophecy of what is yet to come. A temple untouched by corruption, unmoved by war, and unblemished by human hands. What makes this vision so compelling is not merely its architectural beauty, but its purpose. The scroll's concern is not with grandeur for its own sake, but with holiness. Holiness in every inch of space, in every act of worship, in every moment of sacrifice. It reflects a longing for sacredness that permeates not only the temple walls, but those who would enter them. In this sense, the temple is not simply a place to visit. It is a realm to inhabit, and it is not enough to reconstruct it in stone. It must also be constructed within the human soul. The Qumran community, deeply committed to purity, seemed to understand this. For them, temple holiness was not confined to location. It extended into behavior, thought, intention. They saw themselves as guardians of a sacred pattern, and in doing so, they left behind not just instructions for building, but a mirror for the human spirit. Because ultimately, a temple is not holy because of what it contains, but because of who is present within it. This truth echoes through the generations and lands firmly within the message of the scroll, that humanity itself is called to be a temple. Not in metaphor, but in reality. Each life, each heart, each mind, designed with a precision far greater than cubits, and stone is meant to house something greater than itself. The body is not simply flesh and blood, it is a vessel, and what it holds reveals what it honors. The vision of the heavenly temple is not escapism. It is not an unreachable ideal meant to torment the soul. It is a standard, a compass pointing back to the original intention of creation, that humanity and divinity would dwell together in intimacy and purity. The garden was the first sanctuary. The mountain, the tabernacle, and the temple followed. But all were leading toward a greater reality, the indwelling of the divine within the human. The scroll, though ancient, whispers this truth with startling clarity. The temple in heaven is not only above, it is within. That is the shift the scroll demands. It calls the listener not only to gaze upon sacred architecture, but to become it. To walk as living sanctuaries, set apart from compromise, consecrated not by ritual, but by surrender. The holiness described in the scroll is not foreign to the modern world. It is simply forgotten. Lost beneath the noise of culture, drowned by the rise of distraction, it waits to be reawakened in those who will dare to make themselves clean. To be a living temple is not about perfection, it is about posture. It is the willingness to be emptied of what defiles and filled with what sanctifies. It is to accept that the holy presence of God was never meant to be locked behind curtains of stone. It was always intended to dwell in people who would reflect His nature with every breath. The scroll invites, pleads, insists that the temple must rise again. But this time, not in Jerusalem alone, but in every person who is willing to become what they were created to be. The precision of the measurements is not trivial. It is a reflection of divine intentionality. Just as the temple was measured, so too is the soul, not with human metrics, but by the weight of devotion, the depth of love, the consistency of obedience. The structure must be right if the presence is to dwell, and that structure begins not in stone, but in spirit. This is the call hidden in the scroll, that the temple is not a memory, it is a future, and not just a distant one, but a present possibility for anyone who will set themselves apart. The stones may no longer stand, but the pattern remains. And in a world that has traded sacredness for spectacle, the ancient words call once again for purity, for reverence, for a dwelling place worthy of divine presence. Tucked within the ancient fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls lies a subtle but astonishing deviation, a calendar unfamiliar to the religious systems that came to dominate later generations. It is not just a change in days or months. It is a different measure of time itself, a framework that reorients the soul around sacred rhythms instead of human convention. The Qumran community preserved this calendar with conviction, not as an alternative theory, but as a restoration of what they believed to be the original divine order, an order that had been obscured, altered, or forgotten by the wider religious world. Unlike the lunar calendar adopted by mainstream Judaism, a calendar subject to shifting cycles of the moon and periodic adjustments, the Qumran scrolls reveal a solar-based system grounded in a fixed 364-day year. This was not a system of convenience. It did not bend for politics or tradition. It was precise, ordered, and consistent. Every festival, every appointed time, every holy convocation fell on the same day, year after year. There was no guessing, no ambiguity. In their view, it reflected the very character of the Creator, stable, intentional, unchanging. The question then is why this divergence mattered so deeply to them. Why resist the dominant calendar of the temple? Why risk alienation from the religious establishment by adhering to a rhythm out of step with the world around them? The answer seems to rest in something deeper than calculation. For the Qumran scribes, time was not neutral. It was sacred territory. It was a gift entrusted to humanity not simply for scheduling, but for alignment. The proper reckoning of time meant the difference between walking with God or drifting from His appointed path. Festivals celebrated on the wrong day were not simply mistimed, they were misunderstood. And misunderstanding, in the realm of the sacred, is not harmless. It invites distortion, it opens the door to forgetfulness. Their calendar was more than a system. It was a worldview. It structured life not around commerce or politics, but around divine encounter. Sabbaths, new seasons, and holy feasts were not cultural traditions. They were appointments with heaven. And these appointments, if missed or misaligned, threatened to sever the flow of revelation. This is what the Qumran community feared. They saw themselves as a remnant, a faithful echo of a people once attuned to the voice of God, not only in words, but in days and seasons. By preserving the solar calendar, they were not rejecting the past, they were recovering it. This recovery carried implications beyond liturgical accuracy. It touched on prophecy, harvest, covenant, and creation itself. The fixed calendar aligned with agricultural cycles in a way that mirrored the order of Genesis. Light governed day and night, and the seasons followed their appointed times. The festivals, Passover, Shavuot, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, were not simply symbols. They were rehearsals of divine intervention. Each was a shadow of a greater reality, a step in a pattern that revealed not just history, but destiny. When these festivals were celebrated on God's timeline, they became portals, windows through which understanding could enter. When moved or diluted, those portals began to close. One cannot help but wonder how much prophetic meaning has been lost through this drift. How many alignments, warnings, fulfillments, and revelations were overlooked because the world had forgotten the rhythm God set in motion at the foundation of creation. The scrolls hint at the tragic possibility that, in moving to a human rhythm, humanity stepped out of sync with the sacred. And yet, they also suggest hope, that by returning to the original calendar, one might also return to clarity, to vision, to the kind of time that does not simply measure, but reveals. This lost calendar challenges the listener to rethink time itself, not as a tool of productivity, but as a vessel of holiness. Every hour, every day, every season is not arbitrary. It is a canvas on which God paints meaning. The modern world, flooded with deadlines and distractions, treats time as a resource to be spent. The Qumran scrolls remind us that it is not something to control, but something to honor. When time is aligned with divine order, it ceases to be a burden and becomes a blessing. The implications extend further still. If prophecy is tied to appointed times, and if those times have been miscalculated or forgotten, then much of what has been considered mysterious or delayed may simply be misunderstood. The scrolls suggest that divine events are not only spoken, they are timed. Heaven operates on a schedule, one that is not subject to earthly revisions. And those who wish to discern the signs of the times must first learn to recognize the calendar by which those signs are measured. Restoring that rhythm is not about legalism. It is about intimacy. It is about hearing the footsteps of God in the garden once more, not as a mythic memory, but as a present invitation. The calendar preserved in the desert is not a relic of the past. It is a key waiting to unlock forgotten doors. And through those doors lies not just knowledge, but encounter. The Qumran community may have seemed out of step with their world, but they believed they were walking in sync with heaven. Their resistance to the prevailing calendar was not rebellion, it was fidelity. And now, centuries later, that same fidelity confronts the modern reader. Will we continue walking to the rhythm of systems built on convenience and control? Or will we allow ourselves to be reoriented, realigned, and renewed? The calendar may have been lost to most, but it was never forgotten by God, and in its recovery we may discover more than just dates. We may discover divine patterns that reveal where we are in the timeline of history and how close we stand to things long foretold and now fast approaching. For nearly 2 millennia, the scrolls rested in silence beneath the arid cliffs of Qumran, sealed away in caves that neither time nor conquest could easily penetrate. They endured seasons of empire, generations of upheaval, and the collapse and rise of civilizations, all while hidden from the eyes of a world not yet ready to receive them. Their concealment was not an accident, nor a historical oversight. It was intentional, it was appointed. It was, in its truest form, divine restraint, a sacred withholding until the moment would come when their voice could be heard not as an echo of the past, but as a message for the present. What emerges with startling clarity is the sense that their unveiling was meant for now, not just for scholars or theologians, but for the soul of a generation wrestling with its own collapse of meaning. These ancient texts, buried before the fall of the Second Temple and unearthed only after the horrors of a global war, appear at a moment when the world stands once again on the edge of transformation. In their reappearance, there is more than academic intrigue. There is timing, and in divine timing, nothing is coincidental. The question then presses upon the listener: why now? Why were the scrolls withheld through centuries of theological evolution, religious wars, institutional establishment, and cultural revolutions, only to emerge in the 20th century at the cusp of the information age? The answer cannot be found in human reasoning alone, for while man discovers, it is God who reveals, and revelation does not occur in a vacuum. It is always tied to purpose, to readiness, to a divine rhythm unfolding across history's stage. The scrolls contain voices that had been silenced by religious gatekeeping, perspectives that challenge modern assumptions, and truths that disturb the comfort of inherited narratives. They speak of purity in an age of compromise, of justice in a world obsessed with power, and of a divine order that does not bow to human authority. Their emergence now is not simply an invitation to curiosity, but a call to accountability. They confront this generation with a choice: to engage with what has been revealed or to look away in the face of divine disclosure. This moment is not about archaeology alone. It is about alignment. The unveiling of the scrolls aligns with an era in which systems are unraveling, truth is contested, and moral clarity is dissolving into relativism. In such a time, the appearance of these preserved texts feels less like an accident of history and more like a trumpet sounding across the soul of humanity. They carry with them the weight of prophetic urgency. They do not flatter, they confront, and in their confrontation, they awaken. To say that they have been revealed in your lifetime is not merely a statement of chronology, it is a declaration of responsibility. You are not just a passive observer of this moment. You are part of the reason these scrolls have surfaced. Their voice is reaching across time to find those who have ears to hear, hearts to respond, and spirits to rise. This is not an abstract unveiling. It is deeply personal. It touches the individual conscience, the collective direction of societies, and the spiritual trajectory of a world at the crossroads of decision. Contained within the scrolls are themes that resonate uncannily with the conditions of today, warnings against corruption that infiltrates religious leadership, instructions for holy living in defiled times, visions of light triumphing over darkness, not through violence, but through consecration. The justice they describe is not political but divine. The holiness they demand is not performative but transformative. They reach beneath the surface and address the core disease of human rebellion, pride, and forgetfulness. And it is precisely because the world has forgotten that these texts re-emerge. They are not new revelations, but ancient reminders. They are not inventions of a modern mind, but resurrections of truth once spoken and then buried by fear, manipulation, or neglect. The Qumran community did not preserve them for themselves. They preserved them for you. Their act of concealment was simultaneously an act of hope, that one day someone would find them, read them, and live by them. This act of divine unveiling places the present generation in a rare position. Most throughout history have walked without the benefit of such rediscovered clarity. They moved forward with fragments, trusting what remained. But now, something hidden has come to light. And with light comes vision. With vision comes the requirement to walk in accordance with what has been revealed. Ignorance is no longer a defense. These scrolls make ignorance obsolete. They return what was lost and amplify what was diminished. They bring clarity not for speculation, but for transformation. The scrolls speak to this hour with a relevance that defies their age. They know the weight of hidden injustice, the ache for holiness, the hunger for truth that institutions have often failed to feed. They know the cost of righteousness in a world bent toward compromise. And they carry within them the echo of a voice that will not be silenced by time, tradition, or fear. It is the same voice that called prophets from caves, reformers from exile, and truth-tellers from obscurity. That voice now reaches across the centuries and calls to those who are willing to listen, to rise, to return. You stand in the hour for which these scrolls were preserved. This is no longer about history, it is about responsibility. You are not merely witnessing a revelation, you are being invited into it. And whether that invitation is accepted or ignored will shape more than individual lives. It will shape destinies. For what has been revealed cannot be hidden again, not by scholars, not by systems, not by silence. The scrolls, once buried in the clefts of forgotten stone, speak with a tone that seems almost personal. Their unveiling was not merely for the sake of scholars or spiritual historians, nor was it just for the preservation of ancient culture or ritual. Their very presence, surfacing after centuries of silence, insists that something sacred was always meant to reach you. The truths they carry were not meant to remain hidden behind cave walls or locked within academic institutions. They were always intended to be seen, read, heard, and lived by you, in your generation, in your time. What begins as a recovery of historical documents slowly reveals itself to be something far more intimate. These scrolls contain echoes of the divine voice, not bound to one nation, one age, or one temple, but destined for those willing to see beyond the surface. They do not simply answer ancient questions, they ask new ones. Who told you that revelation had ceased? Who convinced you that the voice of God could be confined to printed pages and closed canons? Who persuaded you that mystery was no longer necessary, that discovery was reserved for a select few, that you were too late to receive what was once poured out in deserts and dreams? The truth is simple, but it changes everything. You were always meant to know, not all at once, not in arrogance, but in reverent steps of revelation. The scrolls carry pieces of that knowing, like lanterns scattered through time, now lit again to guide those whose hearts are stirred by more than tradition. They were hidden not because you were unworthy, but because timing matters in the language of heaven. And now that time has come. Now they are in your hands. And with that, the burden of knowing becomes the beginning of transformation. You were meant to know that justice is not an idea, but a heartbeat that moves through the scrolls like a current. It speaks of systems collapsing under the weight of their own corruption, of leadership that once bowed before truth, but later knelt to power. You were meant to know that holiness is not a posture of pride, but of separation, a call to become sacred space in a world that profanes everything. You were meant to know that the spiritual war described within those ancient lines is not past tense. It is active, it is personal, and you are already involved, whether you want to be or not. What you do with that knowledge matters. This unveiling is not entertainment, it is a commissioning. The same way prophets were sent not with comfort, but with confrontation, the same way the teacher of righteousness walked alone, yet unshaken, the same way the sons of light trained for a war that no one else could see, so too are you now brought into the unveiling with purpose. You are not powerless. You are not a spectator. You are the one for whom these scrolls were preserved. Not because you are perfect, but because you are chosen. The fact that you are here, now, listening, absorbing, considering these words is not a coincidence. It's part of a thread woven through millennia, a divine story that did not end with the last chapter of Scripture, but continues now through you. You are not reading the conclusion of history. You are standing in the unfolding of it. There is still more to uncover, more to understand, more to live. The scrolls were not the end. They were the signal that the sealed things are beginning to open. That what was once hidden in deserts is now being spoken in cities, homes, hearts. That what was kept in caves is now reaching screens and voices and stirring lives once dulled by spiritual fatigue. They are here to awaken, to remind, to call back. And they are not asking for admiration. They are asking for response. Now that the truth is visible, now that it has crossed the threshold of silence into the clarity of your hearing, the question is no longer whether God is speaking. The question is whether you will respond, whether you will allow these ancient words to become more than information, whether they will become transformation. What was once concealed has been revealed, not randomly, not carelessly, but with divine precision. And now, it is in your hands. You were always meant to know. Now that you do, the time of waiting is over. The time to awaken has come. If this message stirred something deep within you, if the truths from the scrolls spoke to your heart, then let this be the beginning of something greater. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss future content that dives deeper into the mysteries, revelations, and ancient truths that still speak today. Like the video to help share this message with more people who need to hear it. Leave a comment below to share your thoughts or what part resonated with you the most. And most importantly, share this film with friends, family, and loved ones. Let them hear the message that was hidden for 2,000 years, because they too were always meant to know.